Hello, everyone. Let's see if we can get this going. Is this working? All right. And, yep, we got the first slide. Welcome, everyone. I'm John Travis from Science Magazine, and thanks for coming to this meeting. The reason I organized this session is mainly because I don't know how to write profiles myself. But I'm an editor, and I've been editing profiles for about 10 years. So I've learned something about what I like, what I don't like, and I've been working with a lot of really good writers who do know how to do profiles. But I have always loved profiles. I think when I first got interested in science, maybe science journalism, was reading the profiles in Discover magazine. And many of those were kind of the heroic profiles of scientists. I'm old and cynical, and I look on those with a skeptical eye now. But when I did start out as a writer, I worked at Science News, and they don't do profiles, so I rarely did that. But at Science, I've been editing more and more of them lately, and I wanted to think about why we do profiles, why we make that type of story choice over some other choices. Their profiles are very tough. They can illuminate a topic in different ways and better ways, but they are not the easiest thing to do. And over the last year or two, we've had a few profiles at Science that have made me really think about the genre. Let's see if this, hopefully this won't turn on the music again. All right, there we go. So I'm going to mention a couple of ways that I see a reason to do a profile, and mention a few profiles that put issues to my mind. This was one on Daniel Voitis, who, after many of us just heard Jennifer Doudna talk, he is a CRISPR researcher, and before that he was a TALENs researcher. People forget about TALENs, but they were like CRISPR beta, I guess. And what he does is he works on plant engineering. And we covered CRISPR very early on. I think 2013 we did a really big feature. And after that we kind of covered it incrementally. And so we hadn't really done a big genome engineering story for a while. And our rival Nature had done some that we really liked, including one on plant engineering, which was a big area for CRISPR. And we're like, how can we do the CRISPR plant engineering story? And the way we came up with it was to do a profile of Voitis, because he kind of straddled the two generations of genome engineering. And he had a really interesting story of failure, success, and then he was eclipsed by CRISPR, and then he is basically trying to come back with CRISPR. And I thought it was a great way of doing a research trend, but with a personal element to it. The writer who handled it mainly has covered kind of research stories, hadn't done a lot of profiles, so it was an experiment for her as well. And the kind of the detail of this one I wanted to mention was her first draft had a very long section about him growing up gay in the Midwest. And I looked at this as an editor, and she was interested in it. He had talked about it. It was not an important detail to his scientific career, though. And so to me, it was something that I thought was an easy cut. But we had quite a bit of an argument about, well, maybe this would be a good role model. You don't see many profiles of prominent gay scientists. I said, well, we're more in a more modern age. I don't know if that's true. We ended up cutting it out, and it was one of those fights I have on profiles of what level of personal detail do you keep in the story? What level of kind of character information actually drives the story ahead? And I think that is one of the challenges of profiles. The next one I'll mention is a feature or profile of Beth Stevens, who works on how synapses are pruned in the brain. And many people had written about her work. No one had really done, to our mind, a good profile of her. And so again, it was a way of playing a little bit of catch up, and also I think kind of talking about where she saw the field going. And this was again one where there were a lot of decisions on what personal information to keep in. The original draft had a lot about her family life, the challenges of working, raising 2 kids, and a lot of that detail, and Christy I think is going to talk a little bit about this, I would argue failed the Finkbeiner test. Would we be writing about this if she was a man? And again, the details didn't really push the story. You know, she was obviously an incredibly hard worker. If you look at the pull quote up there, if you can't read it, it's she's like a 4-shot espresso. And I really like that, and I thought it worked well with the headline, which is a play on synaptic wiring. But we were able to get kind of the sense of her working very hard in other ways. So again, we cut out a lot of her family detail in this story. And then the next one, I'd actually be very curious what people in the audience thought about this profile if you read it. If you don't know, Marsha McNutt is the current president of the National Academy of Science, and she was my former boss. She was the editor-in-chief at Science until she took her new job. And we had quite a debate about, should we profile her? What type of conflict of interest do we have? As you know, most of the team had worked with Marsha for 3 to 4 years. We knew her strengths, we knew her weaknesses, we knew a lot of things that probably she would not want in a profile. But she was a very important person now in the scientific community. She has been over the decades, and we felt obligated to do that. So we came up with a creative solution. We farmed it out to a freelancer, Ellen Shell. I don't know if she's around, the co-director of the BU program, and one of my former teachers. And we then also farmed out the editing of it to our former news editor, Colin Norman, who I don't think he ever overlapped with Marsha. So to our feeling, we inoculated ourselves against some conflict of interest. I don't know whether we did to the satisfaction of other people in the community. So, you know, we're expecting a very hard-hitting story, and it had some really good elements, but it was a largely positive profile of Marsha, and she's had an incredible career. And it failed the Finkbeiner test in many different ways as well. We talked about her marriage, we talked about her parents, her clothing, her children, all these different things. And this was one where I think it worked. There were reasons. She was a pioneer in many ways in different male-dominated venues at different points in her career. And I think it worked, and I think it's something where, you know, the rules, and I don't know if Christy would call them rules or not, they're there to make you think about what you cover in a profile. You need to justify everything in a profile, in my view. You know, we are trying to give a glimpse of people, and we're trying to pick out the most important things that reveal who they are, why they're important to the scientific community or to the public. And I think for the most part we did in that story, but I think that's why profiles are very debatable. You know, it's, some people will hate one and another one will love it. I think that's what makes them fun. But I will now turn it over to people who actually write these and do so much better than I would. So Udigit is a former colleague of mine, now a freelancer who's just put out a book, I think, a year ago now, The Spy Who Couldn't Spell, which is a very intriguing title, and it lives up to it, about an FBI hunt for an espionage, or for a traitor with a kind of a curious flaw. But he has also done a lot of profiles for magazines, including with some people who are more challenging than others. And actually, I've gone out of order. Let's see. Well, let me go back. Sorry back there, if you can go to Jennifer first. So Jennifer currently works with me. There we go. And she specializes in a lot of kind of clinical medicine for us and has done profiles of physicians, patients, and as I think she'll talk about, herself, which is probably the toughest profile to write. So, and I'll turn it over to you now, Jennifer.
Thanks, John, and thanks for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. Oh, thank you. So, like John said, I write mainly about medical research and medicine for science. And I found that in writing profiles in this area, it may not be a surprise to many of you that emotions are often running high. We're dealing with issues of life and death. People may be under extreme stress, dealing with grief, fear, and so on. And so that often plays out in different ways, some of which I want to touch on. So the first story, and I'm going to talk about 3 stories quickly. And the first is actually the only of the 3 that I would consider a true profile. This is a story, as you can see, called A Lonely Crusade. And it's about a bioethicist at the University of Minnesota named Carl Elliott. And I was interested in Carl Elliott because he was, and still is, obsessed with suicide of a young man who died in the course of a clinical trial at his university's hospital. And he felt that there had been much wrongdoing and conflict of interest on the part of the doctors and even the administrators connected to this trial, and was essentially trying to kind of bring justice to this man and his family. And I felt this, as many profiles do, this raised larger issues about university trials and conflict of interest and drug studies at universities that many of us have thought about and written about over the years, and telling it through his story seems a nice way to get into that. And one thing that interested me about Carl Elliott is that a lot of people didn't like him. He was really a pariah, and actually this picture shows him working in a coffee shop because he was so ostracized in his own department that he tried to avoid ever going there. And even his family and the people who cared about him were pretty sick of hearing about this case at this point, which made him actually very eager to talk to me because I did want to hear about the case. So that was one thing that was easier about the story. But a challenge that I had with it is that the people who didn't like him wouldn't talk to me. And my big question in this story, and in many other profiles, but particularly in this one, is what motivated this man to do what he is doing. Most people would not do what he did, so why was he doing this? And it sort of sounds like a deceptively simple question, asking what motivates someone, but I feel that it can lead you into all sorts of interesting directions in writing a profile and just trying to understand who someone is, what brought them to where they are today. So I set out to try and answer that with him, but it was difficult because I really needed to kind of see all sides of him, and no one in his department would talk to me. Administrators at the school wouldn't really talk to me. They gave me some written statements that didn't say a whole lot, other than make clear that they didn't like him. And so what I tried to do to compensate for that, which was probably only partially successful, was talk to people who had known him for a really long time, ideally his whole life, and who I could ask some pretty pointed questions of, and who understood that he could be somewhat aggravating and a thorn in people's sides, and could talk to me about that. And so I spoke to his brother, who was tremendously helpful and very candid and really got him. I spoke with a law professor who'd known him and been friends with him for many decades. So I tried to kind of find people like that who had known him at different time points in his life or over a long trajectory of his life, and who could kind of help me understand him as best I could. So this is a completely different story. That's a woman named Rita. And Rita has very high, what we often think of as good cholesterol, HDL cholesterol. So she's known for a long time that she has high good cholesterol. She's always been really proud of it because she thinks it makes her really healthy, and that's a good thing. And a number of years earlier, she had volunteered to be in a genetic study of people who had high good cholesterol because the scientists really wanted to figure out what's so great about these people, and maybe we can turn this into a drug and give it to other people who don't have high good cholesterol naturally. What the scientists ended up finding out was that high good cholesterol may not always be so good. They wrote a research paper, and while they didn't identify Rita by name in the paper, they described her case specifically because she had 2 copies of this gene that was linked to high HDL cholesterol, and she also had more plaque in her arteries than would be expected for someone her age. So her story was kind of highlighted in the research paper. Journalists, including myself, who wrote about this research paper, picked up on her story and kind of further highlighted her story, often starting their stories with it, talking about how her heart was in really bad shape, and then the stories went out there. And again, Rita wasn't named in any of these stories, but about a month or so after I wrote my story, Rita sent me an email, and she said, "You don't know who I am, but I'm actually the person who was in that paper, and now I'm completely freaked out because you've essentially told me that my heart is not in good shape, and I didn't know this." And I felt really bad for her. And it took me down a really interesting path because I ended up writing an article about her and her experience being written about in this research paper, and it raised all sorts of different interesting questions about how researchers communicate with their research subjects because she hadn't known that the paper was coming out and that her story would be in it. She hadn't even known that she might be at risk, maybe, because of her high good cholesterol. But it also raised questions for me about journalists and how we cover, I mean, she's not really a patient, but how we cover people and their medical issues. And it made me think about how in our quest for drama and finding the perfect person to kind of fit a mold we might have in our own minds or a concept we want to present in a story, do we risk exaggerating certain details? And I do think that that did happen in this case. And another challenge that came out for me in this story and that comes out in a lot of medical stories that I write is not becoming overly attached or sympathetic to a subject that I'm writing about. Because a lot of these people, and including Rita, are lovely, smart, generous, kind people. They're often people I could see myself being friends with in another setting. I may feel for them if they've gone through something very difficult, and yet I'm writing an article about them as a journalist, and I have to kind of maintain some distance. And that was something that I struggled with here, and I actually did note that in the story that I ended up writing. So the last story, that's me and my kids a couple years ago. And this is a story that I wrote after myself going through some cancer genetic testing, which I went through because my ancestry, not my family history, but my ancestry puts me at a higher risk of carrying certain mutations linked to breast and ovarian cancer. So I decided that the prudent thing to do would to be tested for these gene variants, and I was tested. And I wasn't thinking of this at all in terms of writing a story at the time, but the experience of going through this testing, and also as someone who writes a lot about cancer genetic testing, exposed for me how much this field is changing in all different ways, and in particular how patients are being given information that is very uncertain right now. And so my editor said to me, you know, do you want to just write about your own experience? And in the end, I decided to do that. And what was striking to me about this story, and this wasn't even a profile of me, although I certainly talked about myself in the story, was how difficult it was to do that and how stressful it was to do that. And the bit that was stressful was not so much sharing my own personal details, but sharing details about other members of my family, because of course genetics is about family, and this was a story about cancer genetics, and so I was talking about other people in my family who'd had cancer or currently have cancer. I wasn't naming them, but I did say in the story that they were all on my father's side of the family, so I felt that one could deduce their last name based on my last name. And I worried about what my responsibilities were to these different family members. Did I need to contact them and ask their permission? Some of these family members I was close to, some I was estranged from, and I wasn't sure how to handle it, and it was stressful. And so I struggled with, do I even include these details? Do I have to contact these people? In the end, I decided, yes, I need to include these details, and yes, I do need to contact these people. So I did contact everyone who was in the story, again, not by name, but by their relationship to me, and asked their permission, and got their permission. But if I had been including more detail or for some reason had felt it necessary to include their name, I think it would have been even more fraught. And so, in this case, I wasn't really on the other side of being profiled because, of course, I had complete control over what went in the story, unlike a real profile subject who doesn't have complete control. But it made me think a lot about being on that other side and the resistance that we might encounter sometimes in an individual we are profiling. I've certainly asked people if I can contact members of their family to learn more about them, and sometimes I've met with resistance, particularly if I'm asking to speak with their parents. And I often haven't always been very sympathetic to that resistance. I feel like, well, I need this to write about you. And this made me a lot more sympathetic because it made me see that other side. I don't know that there's a good answer for how to deal with that, but at least it made me more aware of it. And so these are just some tips that I think about a lot, most of which I've spoken about, except I think the second one. I often try to think of the story like a movie. And I even say this sometimes to profile subjects I'm talking to. If I feel like they're talking in a very abstract way, I might say, well, if you were making a movie of your story, what scenes would you include? What were the really important scenes to you? And that kind of helps them go in a direction that then helps me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. There we go. And now I think we're moving to Udigit. So, as I said, Udigit's a former colleague, freelancer, book author, and has tackled some very challenging subjects, and I will let him chat about that. Want me to do the slides for you?
Sure, yeah.
All right.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. This is probably the biggest crowd I've ever spoken to. I didn't know that, that there are so many science journalists out there making a living. It gives me hope. So what I'll talk about today are profiles. Jennifer, thanks for a great presentation. And John, thank you for the great introduction to our presentations. I wanted to sort of use this title, Human Stories About Science, because even though I'll be talking about profiles and profile writing, I'm really talking about, writing about science through stories of people. So at first, I just want to show all the slides that I have. So this is, very, very quickly, this is a story I wrote for the New York Times Magazine about a man that some of you may have heard about, Diederik Stapel, who was a Dutch psychologist, and I can still call him a psychologist because his PhD wasn't based on fabricated data. But everything else that he did in his research career was a fabrication, but he was very good at it. And so I wrote the story profiling him, and I would call it a narrative profile because it's really the story of how he pulled off such a big scientific con job, what the factors were that led him to do that, and how his internal insecurities sort of clashed with the culture of science, and how it was abetted by certain cultures within his field. Next slide. This is a story that I wrote back in 2010, and actually the editor of the story, Pamela Weintraub, is probably here in the audience. I hope she is. She's a fantastic editor, and she's the one that suggested the idea of this profile to me, and she's the one that really helped me write it, so thank you, Pam. This is a story about Douglas Prasher, and again, this is a narrative profile that tells an actual story about this person's life. Prasher was a scientist, and is still a scientist. He was a scientist who isolated the gene that makes green jellyfish glow. So the gene that's responsible for the production of GFP, which is a protein, which was then used by other scientists to do a whole bunch of studies showing how this protein could be used to illuminate organs, tissues within the bodies of organisms. And the reason that he first got Pam's attention and then Pam suggested him to me was that in 2008, I believe, or 2009, can't remember, 2008, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was given to 3 scientists who had used GFP. Douglas Prasher had given 2 of them the gene so that they could do that work. But when the Nobel was announced, Douglas was, he had dropped out of science and he was living in Alabama as a shuttle driver for a Toyota dealership. And so I, this is a story that talks about, why that happened to him, what that says about the field of science, about this particular field of science, and also about the scientific enterprise in general. Next slide. This is a story I wrote for Science about a man named Bill Baruch, who's a legendary planetary scientist who was actually an engineer and was the man behind NASA's Kepler mission. This is the mission that is credited with the discovery of hundreds of exoplanets. And this is a more traditional profile. I wouldn't call this a narrative profile, really, although every profile is a narrative of a person's life. But this is a story that's more traditional in the sense that it's one of those heroic scientist profiles that John was referring to. But Bill Baruch is a fascinating character, and there was plenty of good material from his life to write about. So what I'll do now is just talk a little bit about some general principles that one could take away, about profile writing from these profiles and from other profiles, good profiles that other people have written, that continue to be written every day. So the first point I wanted to make is that science doesn't happen in a vacuum. When I got into science journalism, my main sort of goal was to do explanatory journalism. I wanted to write about cool things, how cool discoveries get made, and I did that, and I found it very exciting. And then slowly, after maybe 2 or 3 years of doing this, I realized that science is really done by human beings, and that scientists are human beings just like the rest of us. Every human being, everyone in this audience has a story, has a life story, a journey that they have undertaken. And for scientists, the science happens to be embedded within that journey. A science profile, to my mind, has to achieve a few things. Of course, it has to cover the particular breakthrough or the particular research that the scientist has done, which has brought him or her to our attention. But it should also help us to understand why and how that scientist was uniquely qualified to perform that science, to actually carry out that research. And we need to understand, at the end of the profile, how the scientist's mind works, what factors shaped that scientist's thinking and personality that then contributed to doing the science that they did. And so in order to understand those factors, I have found that it's helpful to look more broadly than just the person's science itself. That brings me to, I guess, the core point that I want to deliver, which is that when I'm trying to do a profile, I'm looking for sort of a human frame within which to place the subject. Science is a process of inquiry, experimentation, discovery, but it's sort of fueled by things that are very human to us. Curiosity being one of them, and curiosity is of course an intellectual thing, but curiosity is also a deeply emotional thing. I mean, I remember as a kid, my father is a geologist. He would take me out to these geological field visits out in Rajasthan, which is a state in India. And he was exploring these tungsten deposits at the time. And I remember this time when he took me out in the night to show me this mineral called wolframite, which is a tungsten ore that glows under UV light. And I still remember, how it glowed, and that, and I think maybe 9 or 10 at the time, and it really made a deep impression about the science, what science is and why it's so awesome. But of course, if I simply told you the story, that did you know wolframite glows in the dark, that would be a cool fact. But if I really took you there to that place at the age of 9 or 10, that would make a whole different impression, and that would be a very human experience. So let me just move quickly on because I don't want to usurp other people's time. So when I talk about the human frame or sort of human emotions that drive science, I'm really talking about things like ambition, which is a really core sort of driver of a lot of scientific discovery, including, in addition to curiosity, the fear of failure is a big driver, is a big factor, a human factor that affects everything that we do, whether it's sports or medicine or law or science. The desire to overcome adversity, the sort of the heroic aspect, which we're all drawn to. That's another thing that's deeply emotional. It's not just an intellectual thing. So when I say I try to look more broadly, what am I looking for and how do I report these things? Well, Jennifer touched on it, asking about what motivates a person, which might seem like an obvious question, is actually, there's a lot there to unpack. And so going beyond the scientific into the personal is almost necessary. It's kind of a prerequisite for profile writing. I realize we're getting into interviewing here, and which is a subject unto itself. So I'll leave it here, but I hope that in the Q&A session we can talk a little bit about that. With regard to interviewing and with regard to collecting all of these personal details and trying to understand a personality like Bill Baruch, or if you move back to the first slide, or Dieterich Stoppel, it's important to kind of dig deeper. Once you get an answer, you sort of have to keep digging. And again, this is something that I've learned through experience. I used to take answers for granted. You ask people something, you ask them, oh, what got you interested in such and such a thing? And they give you a pat answer because they've used that answer before. They've told their relatives over Thanksgiving dinner why they do what they do. They've told, strangers, acquaintances. So they're kind of jaded with that answer. And so you need to dig deeper. You need to ask them, well, why, what do you really mean by that? Again, it might seem obvious, but it's only something I've learned with experience. I also have found that time is your ally. On the Douglas Prasher profile, it really helped me to sort of go back to Douglas over and over again, even after I'd spent like 3 days with him in Alabama. Every week I would call him, ask him how he was doing, and he could sort of feel the sympathy in my voice because it was genuine. I really felt for him because he was trying to overcome this great dejection, this sense of having missed the Nobel Prize, even though he knew that there was a lot that had gone into the research that ultimately led to the Nobel. But, his feeling that he had missed the boat somehow, that life had taken him in one direction when he could easily have gone in another, he was trying to overcome that feeling and come to terms with it. And by talking with him about it over and over again, I got a better sense of his sense of despair. So the point I'm making is that time is very critical to the reporting process, you have to allow for more and more time to lapse, just like a scientist out in the field has to collect data. Another aspect of the reporting, and I'll end with this, is the scene and the context. And if you go back to the Stoppel profile, I'll just wrap up with this story. You know, I noticed I spent about 4 days with Stoppel in Tilburg, where he lives, and I noticed that he had this habit of sort of being upset or irritated if people left the door slightly ajar, or if things weren't perfectly symmetrical, you know, against the edge of the table. And I remember sort of driving with him to his parents' home, some 2 hours away, and talking about that obsessiveness of his. And it began to make sense to me that this kind of desire for neatness and tidiness had led to his failing as a scientist, because he was always looking for the neat and tidy result. And I was able to talk about this in his presence with his parents. I was able to talk about his childhood with his parents. So, to make a long story short, just being able to discuss, being able to talk to your profile subject, not just one-on-one, but also in the presence of people that have known him or her for a long time, can be very useful. Thanks.
Thanks, Udijit. I think one of the questions I'm going to ask you when we get up there is, how did you get Stoppel to talk to you and spend 4 days with you? Because I think at least one person or two in this room tried to get him to talk, and he wouldn't. So our next speaker is Joe Chandler, who I think may be one of the people who've flown the farthest to get here from Australia. She's an award-winning journalist who covers social issues, climate, a little bit of everything. She's also now teaching in a journalism department. And Joe, here you go.
And again, thanks very much for inviting me here. I feel very privileged to be here and to be with this panel. And I'm kind of wishing right now I had my Antarctic kit on, standing here. It's so cold. The first time I went to Antarctica, the chief at the Australian scientific base where I was staying shared with me a collection of photographs of himself wearing a very fetching long white satin bridal gown, which he liked to wear to dinner on formal occasions on the ice. I should explain that there is a very long tradition of blokes with beards wearing frocks in the Antarctic. In the old days, it came from the winterers dressing up and doing pantomimes to amuse themselves over very long isolated months. There's nothing sexual about it, and it certainly isn't something I would do back home, the chief explained to me. It's part of living here. And I think basically it's about creating and reaffirming community trust and values. In exposing yourself to possible ridicule by dressing in silly clothes, you're telling your companions that you're trusting them, that they should accept you and not belittle you. People respond to trust, he told me, and they return it. It's the cement of any good Antarctic community. He handed over the photos of himself and said, "And now I'm trusting you. You have the power to make me look ridiculous to a whole nation of newspaper readers. I am trusting you to treat this with more seriousness." In many ways, on reflection, this was quite a formative moment for me. It was also, when you think about it, something of a masterstroke of communication strategy, making me think very carefully about my role and responsibilities as a journalist in this remote outpost of field science, and in similar locations when in the years to come I would embed myself with communities of people who haven't necessarily all consented to be in my sphere of observation, let alone to be in my story. So what's my place in these communities? How can I be part of them, or do I need to stay a part of them? And if I were to remove myself, if that was feasible or safe, what's the point? Why did I come at all? You can flick to the next slide if you like. The The man with the bridal gown was really putting the pressure on me to self-edit, to think about what material I might appropriately use to achieve my mission, which was, and still is, when I can swing it, to tell epic stories about the science going on the front line of the climate story. So I should clarify, my focus is on enlisting scientists as characters in scientific and environmental and sometimes public health and medical storytelling ventures. So I'm not speaking here about fully fledged profiles of individual scientists, where it might be appropriate to delve deep into their individual histories and foibles, strengths and weaknesses, and to explore their contribution to the science. Rather, I'm talking about the process of populating stories from frontline research with flesh and blood characters, putting meat on the bones of the peer-reviewed archive. Sometimes they might be central characters, leading researchers, and with them, I am still trying to resolve the same sorts of questions that my colleagues here talked about: their motivation, their life journey, how did they get here? But sometimes they might be people involved in the broader effort, pilots or cooks or fuel pumpers who are all required to keep this community operating. These are people who I might be living with all too intimately in remote field camps for days, if not weeks at a time. In the scientific field, I've observed the whole gamut of human behaviour: determination, elation, frustration, despair, grief, all great stuff for my stories. I get to sit and intimately get to know people, to be able to observe and collate characteristics that drive them as scientists. Are they busy? Are they laid back? Are they impatient? Are they nervous? Are they meticulous? Are they generous? But what are the other things I might observe spending an uncomfortable week or two with strangers somewhere out at the ends of the earth? Moodiness, madness, drunkenness, depression, unresolved sexual tension, resolved sexual tension, conflict. So what about the rules of enlisting these people into my stories? So I've been doing these projects on and off since 2005. Bit by bit, through trial and error, I've evolved a kind of a guiding checklist and protocol for myself. The first is preparation, and long before we're in position, I've been dealing with my central characters. I've been back and forth with the scientists leading the project to understand the research questions that they will be exploring, their methodology, the problems they anticipate, their hopes, any hiccups they see. I've read their papers and I've done the preliminary interviews, and if there are any particular sensitivities that are likely to come out in the wash when we're all out in the field, personal or research-wise, we've had an ample opportunity to thrash them out. They have a very clear idea of what I'm going to be wanting from them. I get to know them. We pin down the ground rules. I will tell them that as far as I'm concerned, everything will be on the record if it is relevant and to the research endeavour. And that caveat is where things might get woolly. I'll come back to that, but I'll just mention this is one of those things which is relevant but peripheral in some ways. This scientist is a glaciologist called Mark Curran. And when I was at the bar at the research station one night, I heard a story about how he had been involved in an international incident when he was on the bow of an Australian research ship and a Japanese whaling ship passed by, and he made his feelings known by dropping his pants. There were diplomatic representations, but I felt this story was absolutely relevant to his story as a glaciologist and scientist, and so it was part of the story. So that's number one, preparation. Number two, declaration. At the first opportunity when I'm in with the wider cast of people who are in the field, I will make a presentation to everyone involved in the project, explaining who I am and sketching out the outline of the story I've come to get. So typically, this might be at a meeting over dinner or breakfast and it's scheduled in the mess, and I will stand up and give my presentation. I will ask people to reach out to me if they have any concerns. I will tell them that if they do not want to be part of my story, to let me know that I will respect that. But that otherwise, they should understand that when I'm in the aircraft or at the bar or having breakfast or out with them on the boat, I'm always a journalist, and if what transpires is relevant to the research and the context, it's fair game for my story. We will always be on the record unless it's agreed otherwise, but again, there's that caveat of relevancy. Number three, positioning. I wrestled with this for a while. Should I just not go to the bar? I would never have heard that story. Should I not go to the midwinter dress-up party? Should I not strip off to my undies with the rest of them and jump in the billabong after a long day hunting for lizards in blazing heat? In all honesty, and perhaps it's a failing professionally, but I couldn't bear not to be part of that scene, personally and professionally. I want to be as deep in these realities as I can be. I think that going deep is critical to the authenticity of my story. I need that engagement. But I do try to always be obviously engaged and broadcasting my job and what I do. I've got my notebook out on the table. I've got my digital recorder and my camera right there. I'm always sitting at my laptop, backing up, asking about data, scribbling notes. Number 4, relevancy/judgment. And listening to the presentations of the colleagues here today, we're always exercising judgment about what we do or don't include in the profile. So if I was to go to an Antarctic field station to do a story about how people behave at the ends of the earth, how they get along or don't get along, and I witness conflict or madness or bad behaviour, obviously these are elements that would be drawn into my story. But if I am at the same location and my declared story is about a team of scientists doing aerial surveys looking for minke whales in the sea ice, and I witness conflict or madness or bad behaviour, that's when I get my judgment head out. Did this incident have any impact on the work? Did it present a risk to the program or to the individuals? Might it compromise the rigour of the outcome? Is it substantial enough to present a broader challenge to the research program? Is it likely if I go there that it will actually derail my science story? If yes to any of this, except for the last one, if yes to any of those earlier questions, it will end up in my story. I won't edit it out. But if my judgment is that I have witnessed something personal, something peripheral, something intimate that in the ordinary scheme of things I would not be privy to but for our co-location in some extraordinary location, I won't use it. I don't think that this approach undercuts the value of what I do. I think that the trust that the man in the ball gown, in the satin wedding dress, talked about is more likely to build rigour into a story than to diminish it. And I should point out that I used the story about the wedding dress and the man and the leader of the station and his frock, and I published it in the magazine Story. I think that the relationships I try to construct in the field allow me to go deeper with the scientists, to ask them to explore their work beyond the findings that they might eventually publish. I use this material to build an intimacy with them where they will feel comfortable to reflect with me on what they think, what their research means in the wider sense and what it means to them personally. And I try to illustrate that. I'm just going to finish up reading a grab from something I wrote. We're still on the ice. Flick through to the end. Sorry, I forgot about my slides. I'll just stop on that one, or the previous one. So just to show you about remoteness and closeness, so I think my tent's the second from the right down the bottom, right near the toilet. But we were there for 10 days, about 10 of us in this location, and you can tell from the look of it, it's a pretty intimate environment. To try to remove yourself from that community would be a pretty vile prospect, I think. It was a great privilege to be part of it, but at the same time, it's a place where you really do see humans kind of boiled down to their essence. So I finally want to end up, flick ahead a couple of slides. So we went looking for that guy, the fluffy one. So this is the lemuroid possum, the white lemuroid possum. There's some discussion that it may be the first mammalian casualty of climate change, but every time they write it off, one will suddenly pop back up in the forests of far north Queensland. So I wanted to illustrate, I guess, the kind of intimacy that I hope, and the truth that I hope I get to through building trust with scientists in the field. And if you flick to the next slide. So this is the kind of scene that we've got up in the Atherton Tablelands. So setting the scene, we've been out for about a week. I've done this twice now with this team, doing biological surveys, counting up a range of creatures, but in particular looking for that white lemuroid possum. After about a week of biological surveys, of talking to scientists about the changes that they've already seen and the ones they envisage coming, the emerging picture is precarious and frightening. The surveys tell a story of wild creatures fleeing up the hills for safety, but now they are running out of altitude and out of places to hide. We follow them one night after dinner, travelling up as high as we can in a troop carrier to the distant 1,000-metre survey site, 1.5 hours bumpy ride from camp. We ride in companionable silence, diverted by biologist Jeff Middleton's rich musical collection. His iPod filling the truck with melodious pluckings of Indonesian folk tunes, achy, earthy American blues, and African choruses. Every now and again, the shuffle finds not human compositions, but the natural world. The cabin is filled with recordings of birdsong or frog calls downloaded to help Middleton in the unending task of memorising nature's voices. Eventually, we arrive in the enchanted forest. The canopy pulses with life, but we see no sign of the white lemuroid, the glamorous polar bear of the wet tropics. Lemuroids evolved as creatures of cool climate rainforest. Hence, they don't sweat, they don't pant, they don't lick their fur like kangaroos. The leaves that they eat contain toxins and they need water to flush them out. Without it, they can't control their body temperature. Just 4 or 5 hours with their body temperature over 28 degrees Celsius will kill them. In the last decade or so, those temperatures have exceeded every day for over a month at a time. Our little troop of surveyors fall into grateful, respectful silence when we capture a member of the Lemuroid tribe, albeit not a white one, in our torch beams. Middleton records the details, the GPS coordinates of the sighting. I have a question. This scientist is soft-spoken, a considered character with wild, thick red hair pulled through a long ponytail. He wears John Lennon spectacles and a heart on his sleeve affinity with the natural world. I want to know what he thinks about what he's seeing unfurl around us and about the changing environment. Is he optimistic that humanity will find the momentum and the will to act, that the forest might be saved by a campaign of activist brinkmanship matched by political resolve? He takes a long moment to think about it, playing his torch up and down the trees, striding evenly through the dark as he's done countless times before, auditing nature. No, he says with quiet resignation, no, I think we're fucked. Why is he so hopeless? Well, he says there's just so much inertia in the system already. It's all about commitment, the dynamics already at play, unstoppable, still working their way through cycles of physics and biology. His tone is not angry, it's more achingly sad. We walk on in silence, looking for the next pair of shining eyes. And that's it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Joe. Our last speaker is Christy Ashwanden, and the extraneous personal detail that we'll cut from her profile is that she and her husband make wine. The more important professional details are that she is a writer at 538 and has finished a book, I think, coming out soon on sports science, and also a columnist in the past and in the future for the Washington Post. Actually, I think they want us to switch.
All right, can you hear me? So I'm going to talk about how do we write about women and their professions. So specifically here we're talking about science, but I think that a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about apply more broadly to writing about women in whatever profession they happen to be in. So often, this is what happens. A lot of you may remember the infamous beef stroganoff obituary of Yvonne Brill, who was literally a rocket scientist. I mean, here this amazing woman who made so many incredible and important breakthroughs in her field. The first sentence of her obituary in the New York Times read, "She made a mean beef stroganoff, followed her husband from job to job, and took 8 years off from work to raise 3 children. The world's best mom," her son Matthew said. Look, there's nothing wrong with these details about her life. I want to be really clear here that I think it's perfectly fine to make a great beef stroganoff, to make arrangements with your husband, etc. But a lot of women, myself included, are just kind of tired of always being described in gendered terms like this. my colleague, Ann Finkbeiner, got so fed up with this a few years ago. Ann, for those of you who don't know her, is an incredible person. I know her from the blog that we do together with a bunch of other really smart folks. It's called Last Word on Nothing. I hear that space writers are really into it. Anyway, so Ann writes about astronomy a lot, and she had gotten this assignment to write about a female astronomer, and she decided there were a bunch of things that she was not going to do because she was fed up with this. She was not going to write about how this astronomer was a woman. She was not going to write about her husband's job, her childcare arrangements, how she nurtures her underlings, how she was taken aback by the competitiveness in her field, how she's a role model for other women, and how she's the first woman too. Anyway, so Ann wrote a Last Word on Nothing blog post about this experience, and I read it and said, hell yeah. So some of you may be familiar with the Bechdel test, which is a test for Hollywood to look for gender disparities. And so I decided that what we really need here is a Finkbeiner test. So what I did is I took Ann's sort of goals here, these things that she had called out, and I decided these are pretty good rules for writing about women in science. And I just want to point out that this may seem a little bit random, these points that she chose, and maybe they are to a little extent. One thing that's clearly missing, and I'd like to think that it's because it should go without saying, is that there's no mention of gratuitous descriptions of her body or sexualization or objectification, right? I mean, it's 2017. Do we really need to spell that out? Please don't answer that. Anyway, but I think that in general, this is a pretty good way of looking at how is this profile being framed. And these frames are really important. I just saw something on social media the other day. I was looking for it this morning, and I couldn't find it or show this little video. But it was a little experiment that someone had done where they had young children who were sort of at that age where you can't tell their gender, and they dressed them in gendered clothing, and they had a bunch of toys laid out, and then they had adults come in and just ask them to play with the kid for a little while. And what happened was amazing. If it was a little girl, they would get the dolls, and they would say, here, let's play with the dollies. If it was a boy, they would say, here, you know, let's play with the trucks. And the thing that was interesting is they would actually tell the adult that it was the other, you know, they'd tell the adult that the little boy was really a little girl, and vice versa. And what happened was, without even trying, without meaning to, they would direct them to those gendered toys and those gendered roles. And so I think one of the important points of this test is not that, you know, whatever the person's spouse's job isn't important, or that childcare arrangements, if you have children, are not important, but it's that we have these sort of frames that we so often fall into for talking about people. And every time we in the media fall into these frames or use these frames to talk about someone or to write about them, we're reinforcing those expectations. We're reinforcing that this is how we should think about people. This is how, you know, these are categories that we should use to classify people. And I think we need to get away from that. It's not helping anyone. So a few weeks ago, I think it was, I'll just mention to you, if you go to lastwordonnothing.com, I posted the original Finkbeiner test along with a much more detailed explanation of it today. That's today's post. It also links to a post that Ann just wrote that's called Arguing with the Finkbeiner Test, in which she goes through some of the objections that we've gotten about it since then. And I just want to go back, so that first slide that I showed about the beef stroganoff, that came out very shortly after we published the Finkbeiner test. So a lot of people think that the Finkbeiner test was in reaction to that obituary. It was actually the opposite. It got a lot of attention for the Finkbeiner test, which was great, I guess. But we've gotten a lot of pushback, particularly on this one thing, and that is, so, you know, I was calling this genre of story that I call it like the lady who genre, where it's like, this is a lady who does this thing. Well, and so people say, well, isn't it important to say that she was the first woman to, you know, discover dark matter, for instance, something like that. You know, shouldn't the gender, so this question comes, and the response I'll show in a second comes directly from Ann's post. She and I are of the same mind about this, but there's this sense that, like, we need to mention that she's the first woman to do whatever. And I'll just say here that We're not saying that you can never, ever say this. It's really important that we continue to write about and talk about gender in science and gender in society. And so it's absolutely okay to mention this stuff when you're writing a story that's about gender disparities in science, or is about like how sexist the culture is that made it so hard for women to do this, or whatever, these things. But if you're just writing a regular profile of someone as a scientist about their science, this is actually not about that. So Ann's answer is no, you don't need to mention this. They're not about the science, they're about prejudice in the fields of science, about blinkering prize-giving committees, about expectations in the students, and that's a different story. And so this goes back to what I was saying earlier about these frames. Like, it's sort of this we need to think about the frames that we're using to talk about stories, and what we're saying here is that we shouldn't be using these old frames. And so to explain this pushback against why isn't it okay to say she's the first woman to, I just want to do a little thought experiment. Imagine that you're writing about professional drivers, okay? Would you write about first dog to drive a car? Yes, that's totally relevant. It's super remarkable that a dog is driving a car. Like, wow, like here the fact that it's a dog is actually, that's relevant, okay? Part of the story, go ahead. First chicken to drive a car. That's pretty amazing too. Like, I say put it in the story, okay? What about first guy wearing a straw hat to drive a car? Yeah, not so much, right? Not really that relevant. What is that? Is that preventing him from driving the car? Yeah, you're not gonna do that. First guy with a tattoo to drive? Yeah, not so much, right? Yeah, this is kind of a joke, but I think it is worth thinking about. Yeah, I think John did a really nice job earlier talking about this. I think this issue goes beyond just gender, right? And John gave an example of a story that the first draft had spent a lot of time talking about how the profile subject was gay, and eventually they realized that that wasn't relevant to the story. It wasn't that they didn't want to say it or they shouldn't say it. It was just that it was sort of a distraction, and that wasn't the important thing. Really, the takeaway here is to write about her in her profession, not as a gender. And, you know, I know some people, this is hard, but I think there's a really easy shortcut. If you wouldn't say it about a man, don't say it about a woman. Can you imagine that beef stroganoff lead for a male scientist? Like, not gonna happen, right? So there's another question that has come up too. So this idea that, you know, we shouldn't always be framing about how it was so hard, she had children and she had to take time off and childcare. Like, that stuff's all true. Like, it's really hard to have kids and be in your profession and all of this. It's not about dismissing those things, but it's just that should not be a male or female thing. And so a lot of people said, well, you know, the solution shouldn't be that we shouldn't talk about childcare or mothering among women. We should just talk about it with men too. But Ann and I are sort of, again, of the same mind. Nope. Like, again, if this is a story about a female scientist and her science, then this just isn't relevant. If you want to humanize them, you know, here are some other questions you could ask. How did you get interested in your field? How do you pursue your interests? How did you end up where you are? Do you worry about being wrong? What parts of your life or character led you to work on something so difficult? And what helped you succeed? These are just a few things that you can ask. But again, I think the point is that we're getting away from that old frame of like, you're a woman, here's what you're supposed to be doing. Oh my God, this is so weird, you're doing something else, and this isn't what we're expecting. And like, we need to like emphasize that you're not meeting our expectations of what a woman should do. So that's all I'm gonna say. I hope that there will be a lot of questions, and I tried to keep it short. I think everyone's going to come up now.
Thanks a lot, Christy. If the rest of the panelists can come up. I'm pretty good at cutting stories short, but not at cutting speakers short. So we don't have a ton of time, but I'm hoping that people do have questions. And is there a mic somewhere? Or I can pass around the mic?
Yeah, you
have both the mics.
The question mic.
All right,
John.
I see a hand there.
Can we use the microphone, please? I don't think No, because we have.
Here it is. And here's the microphone. Thank you. I was struck that at least two of you, it seemed like three of you talked about how long a time you spent between, I guess, conceiving the idea and getting published, which is kind of unusual. How long,
No,
how
it's
long
not.
did you spend? And do you think that's unusual?
Do you mean how long do we spend with a profile subject?
Yeah, from conceiving it published,
Yeah.
it sounded like some of you were spending months. Maybe.
I'll speak to that because I think actually you, Digit, and I have done this somewhat differently. I've had often the experience, maybe because I write about doctors who will not give me much of their time. I've had experiences where someone will give me 2 hours of their time, and that's it. And I have to write a profile from that. I agree wholeheartedly that if you can spend a week with somebody or keep going back to them over a long period of time, that's ideal, but it doesn't always work out that way, and I don't think it necessarily precludes a profile.
Yeah, it's really varied, but yeah, typically I've found that not just the amount of time that I was able to spend with the subject, but the length of time over which those interactions occurred, the richer the profile grew, simply because I was able to digest things they said in one conversation, go to some other people, get feedback, then come back to them, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think it's that unusual, actually. I think a lot of profiles just require that kind of investment of time.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Hi. I'm Stephanie Sutherland, a freelancer. Several of you mentioned, particularly Jennifer, I wanted to pick up on what you talked about, getting too close to your subject of a profile. And for me, I'm mostly profiling patients rather than scientists or the clinicians. So I wanted to hear from each of you a little bit what you think about, on the one hand, as you were just saying, it gets really richer the more detail you have about someone. But then, as Jennifer was saying, you don't want to get too close. And then on the other hand, you wrote about yourself, so that's as close as you can get. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about that, like writing about someone who maybe you already know or is close to you, or just about that keeping distance, and can you separate a relationship or things you know about someone from what is relevant to the story?
Well, I'll try like a very quick answer because I know time is short. I think John was asking me earlier about how I managed to get Dieterich Stoppel to open up, and it relates to the question you were asking, which is once you get close to somebody, because obviously Dieterich Stoppel trusted me enough to open up to me, and the question is, once you get close enough to somebody, how do you let that affect what you're writing? And my answer is that I tell them that they won't be surprised by what I write, but I offer them no promises. I say that, you may not like what I write, but you won't be surprised. Like nothing will come out of left field.
I'll talk quickly to that. I think one thing I do, and Joe mentioned this as well, is sort of reinforcing my role as a journalist. So taking notes in front of them, talking about my fact-checking process, making it clear, I'm a journalist, I'm writing about you, this isn't a friendship. And to kind of show that in your interactions wherever possible, if you talk about on the record versus off the record, in whatever ways it comes up, is helpful to maybe maintain a little bit of distance. It doesn't necessarily stop you from caring about that person. We're all human and we may care about them, but it at least maintains some boundary.
I just wanted to say it could be really hard. So you were talking about working with patients, if I was understanding that correctly. Sorry, the speakers are facing that way. And I think there's a distinction to be made between profiling a scientist where it's someone who's like very well known in their field and maybe very media savvy versus someone who is opening up their sort of story to you, and they're not a famous person, or they may have, they're sort of making themselves vulnerable in a different way. And I think in that instance, it may be worth at the very beginning setting some ground rules and saying, like, laying out expectations. Because one thing I've noticed, and we were talking about this over lunch, that happens very often is they start to feel very comfortable with you, and all of a sudden you sort of are getting these signals like, wait, I need you to know that I'm not your friend, but people don't realize that, and that can be really awkward. But I do think that it's a little bit different situation in that case than it would be, for the guy who faked the data and stuff like that. Like, those are sort of fundamentally different, right?
Sure, but let's just go to the next question.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Jolly. I work at the National Center for Supercomputing. My question really is for Christy, but anybody please feel free to chime in. You talk about gender being relevant to the story, and I oftentimes spend a lot of time arguing with researchers about relevancy, the scope of my story. And so my question is, when you're profiling a researcher who feels very strongly that gender, in fact, is very relevant to their profile, I guess, how do you go about that? I mean, I feel like it's particularly difficult to say, no, this really isn't the scope, or this isn't, but they feel so strongly that that is part of their experience and their journey.
So
Thank you.
I think it's a little bit different when you're going to profile someone and this person says, look, I've faced these problems, I've had to overcome this, there are these issues, whatever, the things that you're saying, and they come to you and they say that's what they want to talk about, versus this frame where it's just like a given that the way this will be discussed and sort of the framework and the framing of the story, the way that the situation is presented will be automatically in gendered terms. So I think that there are a lot of situations where it is okay, and particularly if that source is telling you that that's important to them and it's something that has, that is a part of them and is a part of who they're projecting. I think some of what we're objecting to is when those sorts of things are pushed on someone. So someone who's like accomplished this amazing thing, like say, discovering dark matter, and like all the journalists want to talk about how hard it is to be a mother and a scientist, instead of like, wow, that's a pretty damn amazing discovery, let's talk about that. And so it's not that we shouldn't discuss this. Like I said earlier, like we need to keep discussing it. It's just that it shouldn't be the only conversation we can ever have about women.
Hi, Tamika from the Bahamas. My question is, I don't know if any of you have ever written profiles for way younger audiences, like maybe primary schoolers. So I'm interested in knowing whether you would change your writing approach, adjust it in any way. And the reason I'm asking is because my colleagues and I are interested in writing profile pieces, but for younger audiences.
I've never written for kids.
By younger audiences, did you mean like kids or?
8 to 10.
Okay, yeah. I think there are actually people in this audience who specialize in doing that sort of work, and I think fundamentally the rules wouldn't be different, but I guess I guess the science needs to be explained a little more simply, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just winging it.
I'd probably have to be a little more careful with my language.
Right. No more underwear jokes, Joe. Yeah.